Welcome to Readings in English, the channel where you'll learn English through engaging and didactic stories. We all know that learning English can be challenging. Whether it's grasping new vocabulary, mastering pronunciation, or understanding tricky grammar rules, the journey is full of ups and downs. But here, on this channel, we turn those challenges into exciting adventures through stories that not only entertain, but also teach. Today's story is about a determined farmer from a small village. Eager to expand his business, he decides to learn English. With the help of online tutorials, he starts practicing English in the most unique way by talking to his animals while working on his farm. You'll see how he creatively applies English to his daily tasks and how his language journey leads to new opportunities. Let's dive into this inspiring tale and see how little creativity can make learning English a part of your everyday life. Samuel woke up early as usual, the faint light of dawn barely peeking through the small windows of his modest farmhouse. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of the land he knew so well. His routine was ingrained in him. Years of hard work had molded his life into a predictable series of events, all revolving around the care of his farm and animals. As he swung his legs over the side of the bed, he sighed, already feeling the weight of the day ahead. There was a sense of fulfillment in his work, yes, but it was accompanied by a deepening frustration, one that gnawed at him more with each passing day. The village where Samuel lived was small, isolated from the larger towns and cities that lay miles away. His farm, passed down from generations before him, was his pride, but also his cage. The crops he grew and the animals he tended were enough to sustain him, but barely. He dreamed of more, of expanding his business beyond the boundaries of the village, of selling his produce in larger markets where his hard work could yield greater rewards. Yet, every time he entertained the thought, reality struck. Samuel had no formal education, and the language that would open doors for him, English, was as foreign to him as the cities he longed to reach. He trudged out to the barn, his boots heavy with mud from the recent rain. The cows greeted him with low, lazy moos, and the chickens scratched restlessly at the ground. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the letter that had arrived the previous week, an opportunity from a market in a nearby town. It had been written in English, and despite his best efforts, Samuel couldn't make sense of most of it. He had asked a friend to help him, but the idea of relying on others to understand his own business dealings left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. If he wanted to grow, to reach the places he dreamed of, he would have to learn. He would have to find a way to make English part of his world, even though it seemed impossible. The sun was higher in the sky by the time Samuel finished the morning chores. He returned to the house, wiping sweat from his brow. His thoughts still swirled with uncertainty as he sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. For a moment, he considered ignoring it altogether, going back to his comfortable routine. But something inside him refused to settle. He knew that if he let this opportunity slip away, it might not come again. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself to make a decision. He would learn English, no matter how difficult it seemed. He had to. Determined, Samuel reached for his phone, an old second-hand model he had purchased years ago. He wasn't good with technology, but he had seen people in town use their phones for all sorts of things, including learning new skills. If there was a way to learn English, surely it would be through this small device. After fumbling through menus and struggling with the unfamiliar apps, he eventually found what he was looking for, an online tutorial that offered basic lessons in English. His hands shook slightly as he pressed play, the unfamiliar sounds of the English language filling the room. It was strange, foreign, and overwhelming, but Samuel knew he had taken the first step towards something bigger. That night, after another long day of work, Samuel sat at the kitchen table again, repeating words and phrases from the tutorial. He practiced saying simple things like hello, thank you, and how are you? It felt odd speaking into the empty room, but he pushed through the discomfort. His animals became his audience. The next morning, as he milked the cows, he tried out his new phrases, speaking to them as if they could understand. Good morning, he said, patting the side of a cow. How are you? The cow gave no response, of course, but it made Samuel chuckle. Slowly, he began to incorporate English into his daily life, using the language as he tended to the animals, repaired fences, and harvested crops. Weeks passed, and Samuel's routine began to change. His mornings were still filled with hard labor, but now they were also filled with English words and phrases. The more he practiced, the more comfortable he became. The strange sounds started to feel less foreign, though his progress was slow and often frustrating. There were moments of doubt, times when Samuel wondered if it was all worth it. But every time he felt like giving up, he remembered the opportunity waiting for him if he could just unlock the door to the English-speaking world. One morning, as Samuel stood in the barn brushing down one of his horses, he noticed something different. He had been speaking to the horse as usual, practicing a new set of vocabulary words from the tutorial. This time, though, something clicked. The words came easier, the sentences formed more naturally. He realized with a surge of pride that he had understood the instructions on a bag of feed that was labeled in English. It was a small victory, but to Samuel it felt monumental. The satisfaction of that moment lingered with him throughout the day, renewing his determination. He began to see his English lessons not as a burden, but as a challenge he could overcome. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing day, Samuel's confidence grew. He had a long way to go, but now, for the first time, he truly believed that he could learn this language. It was a key that would unlock the future, He had always dreamed of a future where his farm could thrive, where he could sell his produce to larger markets, and where his hard work would be recognized beyond the boundaries of his small village. As the chapter of his journey closed that evening, Samuel sat on his porch, the letter from the town market in his hand once again. This time the words didn't feel so daunting. He knew that, soon enough, he would understand every line, and when that day came, the world would no longer seem so far away. The second chapter of Samuel's journey began with a renewed sense of purpose, but it wasn't long before the initial excitement started to fade. Learning the basics of English had been challenging, yet somehow rewarding. He had managed to memorize simple phrases, and his practice with the animals had made the process less daunting. But now, as Samuel delved deeper into the more complex aspects of the language, his frustration grew. The tutorials were moving faster and he could keep up with, introducing concepts like grammar rules and tenses that seemed impossible to master. Words felt jumbled in his mind, and the more he tried, the more confused he became. The once clear path ahead now seemed cluttered with obstacles. Samuel's evenings at the kitchen table were no longer filled with small victories, but with self-doubt. He would sit for hours, rewatching the same tutorial videos, trying to grasp what felt like a foreign code. His patience wore thin. As he stared at the notebook in front of him, filled with messy attempts at writing English words, Samuel felt a deep sense of inadequacy creeping in. How could he ever hope to understand a language that felt so foreign, so far from his everyday life? Despite his frustrations, Samuel refused to give up. Every morning, he continued his routine, mixing English with his work on the farm. He talked to the cows in broken sentences, commanding the chickens in English, even when they didn't respond the way he hoped. It became a ritual, a way of convincing himself that he was making progress, but inside, the doubt was growing. The villagers, unaware of his private struggle, began to notice Samuel's odd behavior. Some would chuckle when they passed by his farm and heard him muttering to the animals in a language they couldn't understand. Others whispered that Samuel was wasting his time on a foolish pursuit. Their quiet judgments stung, adding another layer to the burden Samuel already carried. The isolation was suffocating. Samuel had no one to talk to about his struggles, no one who could relate to the journey he had undertaken. In the quiet of the evening, after the animals were fed and the sun had set, the weight of his loneliness settled over him. There were moments when he wondered if it was all worth it, moments when the temptation to abandon his dream became almost too much to resist. But just as the despair threatened to overtake him, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while Samuel was mending a fence on the edge of his property, he turned on his small radio, something he often did to break the silence of the long workday. The familiar static of the rural broadcast hummed through the air, but then a program in English began. It was just background noise at first, but as Samuel worked, a few words caught his attention. They were words he had learned from his tutorials, words that he recognized. His hands stilled as he listened more closely, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't much, just a few phrases here and there, but for the first time, Samuel understood something spoken in English without the help of a tutorial. The realization hit him like a wave. He could do this. He was doing this. It was the spark he needed to reignite his determination. That evening, Samuel approached his studies with a renewed energy. He went back to the tutorials, but this time he didn't just watch passively. He rewound, repeated, and focused on understanding, not just memorizing. The complexity of the language still frustrated him, but now he saw it as a challenge he could overcome rather than a wall blocking his progress. Encouraged by his small victory with the radio broadcast, Samuel decided to expand his practice beyond just speaking to the animals. He began labeling things around the farm in English as tools, the barn doors, the feed sacks. Every time he used something, he would say its name in English. When he worked, he talked to himself in English, describing what he was doing. It was slow going, but the more he immersed himself in the language, the more familiar it became. One evening, after a particularly long day of working and studying, Samuel sat down with a new goal in mind. He would push himself even further. It wasn't enough to just practice in the safety of his farm. If he wanted to truly grow, he would need to test his skills in the real world. The thought made his stomach twist with anxiety, but he knew it was the next step. There was a farmer's market in a nearby town where English was commonly spoken, a place where he could try to interact with buyers and vendors. It would be a challenge, but Samuel was no stranger to hard work. In the days that followed, Samuel's preparations took on a new focus. He practiced common phrases he might need at the market, things like asking prices, discussing produce, and talking about his farm. He rehearsed every scenario in his mind, determined to be ready for whatever conversations might come his way. The fear still lingered, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of excitement. He was ready to take this next step, no matter how difficult it might be. The morning of the market came sooner than Samuel expected. As he loaded his produce into the back of his truck, his heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't like anything he had done before. The familiar comfort of his farm was behind him, and ahead lay the unknown. But Samuel reminded himself that he had come this far. He had learned to read labels, to understand basic conversations, to grasp words on the radio. This was just the next part of the journey. The drive to the market was filled with nervous anticipation. As the small town came into view, Samuel's palms began to sweat. He parked his truck, unloaded his produce, and set up his stall with shaking hands. The market was bustling with people, vendors calling out their prices, customers haggling, and the sounds of English swirling around him. It was overwhelming, but Samuel steeled himself. This was what he had worked for. Throughout the morning, Samuel had a few brief interactions with customers. Some were in his native language, others in English. The English conversations were halting and awkward, with Samuel struggling to find the right words, but he managed. Each time he succeeded, even in a small way, his confidence grew. The road ahead was still long, but Samuel had taken a giant step forward. As the day came to a close and he packed up his stall, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Returning to the farm that evening, Samuel reflected on the day's events. It hadn't been easy, but he had done it. He had faced his fears, spoken English in a real-world setting, and come out the other side stronger. The road to mastering the language was still ahead of him, but now Samuel knew he could walk it. The challenges would keep coming, but so would the victories, and Samuel was ready for both. Samuel's first visit to the market had been humbling. He had faced the realities of his limited English and realized just how much more there was to learn. But instead of feeling defeated, he returned to his farm with a renewed determination. The small victories he had experienced kept him going, and each day was a new opportunity to build on what he had learned. He began to incorporate even more English into his daily routine, not only speaking it aloud as he worked, but also writing down new words he encountered and practicing them throughout the day. The morning air was crisp as Samuel woke early to tend to his animals. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue across the fields. He greeted the animals in English as usual, though the words still felt foreign on his tongue. Today, however, there was a sense of purpose behind each phrase he uttered. He had a plan. Samuel knew that if he was going to grow his business and truly master English, he needed to push himself further. The market had been just the beginning. His goal now was to engage more actively with people, forcing himself into situations where he would need to use English more frequently. As he fed the cows, Samuel thought about how far he had come. The memory of that first day, struggling to understand the words in the letter from the town market, seemed distant now. Back then, even the simplest English phrases had felt impossible, but now Samuel could hold basic conversations, albeit with some difficulty. The progress, though slow, was steady, and it filled him with a quiet pride. He had come to understand that learning a language wasn't just about memorizing words. It was about perseverance, about showing up day after day, even when the road felt long and the goal seemed far away. Later that day, Samuel decided to take another step forward in his journey. He made the decision to expand his practice beyond the familiar confines of his farm. There was a cafe in town where many of the locals, as well as a few tourists, gathered. Samuel had heard that English was often spoken there, especially by the younger generation and the occasional travelers passing through. The idea of sitting among them, listening, and perhaps even participating in conversation both excited and terrified him. The cafe was a small, cozy place tucked away near the town square. As Samuel entered, the familiar hum of conversation surrounded him, some in his native language, others in English. He found a quiet corner and ordered a cup of coffee, listening intently to the conversations around him. It felt strange to be there in this place where language flowed so easily for others, while he struggled with every word. But Samuel reminded himself that this was part of the process. Every word he understood, every sentence he could follow, was a victory. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, something unexpected happened. A young man sitting at a nearby table struck up a conversation with him. At first, Samuel panicked. The words tumbled out of the young man's mouth too quickly, and Samuel barely understood what was being said. But instead of retreating, Samuel took a deep breath and did his best to respond. He didn't have all the words he needed, and his sentences were clumsy, but the young man smiled and encouraged him to keep going. It was a simple conversation about the weather and farming, but for Samuel, it felt monumental. That brief exchange left Samuel feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. He had taken another step outside of his comfort zone, and though it had been difficult, it was also rewarding. The kindness of the stranger had reminded him that people were often more understanding than he expected, especially when they saw someone trying to learn. Samuel returned to the farm that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just learning for himself, but for the future. He envisioned a future where he could communicate with a wider world, where his farm could thrive beyond the boundaries of his small village. In the following weeks, Samuel continued his efforts. He frequented the cafe more often, each time forcing himself to engage in small conversations. The nervousness he had felt at first began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. It wasn't that speaking English had become easy. It was still a challenge every time he opened his mouth. But now there was a sense of excitement in the challenge, a belief that he could overcome it if he kept pushing forward. As the weeks passed, Samuel's understanding of English deepened. He found himself able to pick up more words and phrases from the radio broadcasts he listened to while working in the fields. He even began to read short articles online, using a dictionary to help with unfamiliar words. It was slow going, but Samuel didn't mind. Each new word he learned felt like a small victory, another step closer to his goal. One day, as Samuel was preparing to head into town, he received a letter from a potential buyer in a neighboring city. This was a kind of opportunity he had been working toward, a chance to sell his produce in a larger market. The letter was written entirely in English, and for the first time, Samuel didn't feel overwhelmed by it. He sat down at the kitchen table, carefully reading through each sentence. There were words he didn't understand, but instead of feeling discouraged, he grabbed his dictionary and worked through them one by one. By the time he finished reading the letter, Samuel felt a surge of pride. Not only had he understood most of it, but he also realized that he could respond in English, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. He wrote a reply, carefully choosing his words, and sent it off with a sense of accomplishment. As the sun set that evening, Samuel stood on his porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The journey he had embarked on was far from over, but for the first time, he could see the results of his hard work taking shape. His English was still imperfect, but it was improving every day. More importantly, Samuel had begun to see himself not just as a farmer, but as someone capable of growth, of learning, and of achieving more than he had ever thought possible. The next step in Samuel's journey would be challenging, but he no longer feared the challenges ahead. Instead, he welcomed them, knowing that with each new word he learned, with each conversation he had, he was moving closer to the future he dreamed of. A future where his business could expand, where his farm could thrive, and where the boundaries that once seemed so unbreakable would no longer hold him back. Samuel had reached a turning point in his journey. His confidence was growing, and his ability to speak and understand English was improving day by day. Yet, as with any journey, the road ahead was not without its challenges. Samuel had recently experienced a small but significant victory. He had held a conversation with a customer at the market entirely in English. Though it had been a simple exchange, it filled him with a sense of accomplishment that he had never known before. It was a moment that marked just how far he had come, and it fueled his desire to push even further. In the days that followed, Samuel found himself reflecting on the changes in his life. The isolation he had once felt so deeply was beginning to fade. Where there had once been fear and doubt, there was now a growing sense of belonging. He no longer felt like an outsider in a world dominated by a language he could not understand. Instead, he was beginning to see the possibilities that lay ahead, possibilities that extended far beyond his small village. The idea that he could expand his business, reach new markets, and connect with people in ways he had never imagined was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a reality. One afternoon, as Samuel sat on his porch, a letter arrived from a potential buyer in a neighboring town. The letter was written in English, as most of the business correspondence he received now was. Without hesitation, Samuel opened it and began to read. For the first time, he didn't need to reach for a dictionary or ask for help. He understood the contents of the letter fully. The buyer was interested in purchasing a large quantity of Samuel's produce for a market in a nearby city. It was an opportunity that could significantly increase his income and broaden his customer base. Samuel sat back in his chair, staring at the letter in his hands. It was moments like these that made the months of hard work, the countless hours of studying, and the struggle to learn feel worth it. He could hardly believe that he was now negotiating deals in English, something that had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge. His mind raced with possibilities. He envisioned his farm growing, his produce being sold in larger markets, and his name becoming known in towns and cities beyond the boundaries of his village. The thought filled him with excitement and pride. The next morning, Samuel prepared for what would be the biggest deal of his life. He gathered the necessary documents, prepared his produce, and set out for the city where the bear had requested to meet. As he drove, his thoughts drifted back to the early days of his journey. He remembered the frustration of those first lessons, the feeling of inadequacy that had plagued him, and the countless times he had considered giving up. But now all of that seemed like a distant memory. He had persevered, and that perseverance had brought him to this moment. When Samuel arrived at the meeting place, a large market on the outskirts of the city, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. This was unfamiliar territory, and despite his growing confidence, he still felt the weight of the situation. This was not just a small deal at the local farmer's market. This was an opportunity that could change the course of his business. He took a deep breath, reminded himself of how far he had come, and stepped out of the truck. The bear was waiting for him near the entrance to the market, a man in his 40s with a friendly smile. They shook hands, and Samuel introduced himself in English, feeling the words flow more naturally than they ever had before. The conversation began smoothly. They discussed the terms of the deal, the quantity of produce, and the logistics of transportation. Samuel felt confident, even as the conversation turned more complex with discussions about pricing and delivery schedules. But then, just as things seemed to be going well, something happened that caught Samuel off guard. The bear asked a question that Samuel didn't fully understand. The words seemed jumbled, and for a moment, Samuel froze. His mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning of the question, but the pressure of the situation made it difficult to think clearly. He felt a familiar sense of panic rising in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced in the early days of learning English. Samuel apologized and asked the bear to repeat the question. This time he caught a few more words, but the meaning still eluded him. The bear, sensing Samuel's struggle, smiled kindly and rephrased the question in simpler terms. Relief washed over Samuel as he finally understood. The moment of panic passed, and the conversation continued without issue, but the experience had shaken him. It reminded him that, despite his progress, there were still challenges ahead. He hadn't mastered English yet, and moments like this one would continue to test him. The rest of the meeting went smoothly, and by the time they had finalized the deal, Samuel felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. As he drove back to his farm, he reflected on the setback he had experienced during the meeting. It was a reminder that learning a language was a continuous journey, one that would be filled with ups and downs. But Samuel also knew that he had the strength to keep going. He had faced setbacks before and overcome them, and he would do so again. That evening, Samuel sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The deal he had secured was a significant milestone in his journey, but it was only the beginning. There would be more opportunities like this one, more challenges to face, and more victories to celebrate. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Samuel felt a deep sense of pride in what he had accomplished. He had come so far from the man who had once struggled to read a simple letter in English. Now he was conducting business deals, negotiating terms, and expanding his horizons in ways he had never thought possible. But more than that, Samuel realized that this journey had changed him in ways that went beyond language. He had gained confidence, resilience, and a belief in his own potential. The limits he had once placed on himself, the boundaries that had seemed so unbreakable, were no longer there. He had proven to himself that he could achieve more than he had ever imagined, and that realization filled him with a sense of purpose and determination. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Samuel knew that there was still much to learn. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more opportunities to grow. But he was ready for them. His journey was far from over, and he was eager to see where it would lead next. With a smile on his face, Samuel stood up, feeling the cool evening breeze against his skin. He had taken another step forward, and with each step, the future he had once dreamed of was becoming more and more real. As Samuel entered the final stretch of his journey, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but also a renewed determination to push himself further. The breakthrough he had been waiting for was within reach, but he knew that it would take even more effort to fully realize the future he dreamed of. His business was starting to grow, and the deals he had secured were proof that his hard work was paying off. But Samuel wasn't satisfied with just small victories. He wanted to master English to the point where he could confidently navigate any situation without hesitation or doubt. One of the first things Samuel decided to do was hire a tutor. He had reached the limits of what he could learn on his own through tutorials and practice. While his progress had been steady, he knew that he needed more structured guidance to refine his skills. After asking around in town, Samuel found a tutor who specialized in teaching English to adults. The tutor agreed to meet with them once a week, and from the very first lesson, Samuel felt the difference. The tutor helped him understand the more complex aspects of the language, like grammar rules and pronunciation, which had always been a struggle for him. Each session was challenging, but Samuel could feel himself improving in ways he hadn't before. The lessons were intense, but they also gave Samuel a sense of clarity. For the first time, he felt like he was truly mastering the language, not just learning bits and pieces. The tutor encouraged him to push beyond his comfort zone, to engage in conversations that forced him to think quickly and respond in English. At first, it was difficult. Samuel stumbled over his words and struggled to find the right phrases. But as the weeks went by, he found himself becoming more comfortable with the flow of conversation. The fear of making mistakes, which had once held him back, began to fade. The next test of Samuel's abilities came during his return to the market. This time, however, he wasn't just going to sell his produce. He had arranged meetings with several buyers who had shown interest in his products, and he knew that these conversations would determine the future of his business. As he prepared for the trip, Samuel felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He had come so far, but there was still a small part of him that feared failure. What if he misunderstood something important? What if he couldn't express himself clearly? These doubts lingered in the back of his mind, but Samuel pushed them aside. He reminded himself of the progress he had made, of the conversations he had held, and the deals he had already secured. When Samuel arrived at the market, the atmosphere was familiar, but different this time. He no longer felt like an outsider. As he set up his stall, he noticed a few of the buyers he had spoken to in the past, and this gave him a sense of comfort. His first meeting was scheduled for mid-morning, and as the time approached, Samuel took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was to come. The beer arrived promptly, a man from a larger city who was looking to purchase produce for several markets. They shook hands, and Samuel greeted him in English. Feeling the words come naturally, the conversation began smoothly. They discussed the quality of the produce, the quantity needed, and the logistics of delivery. Samuel found himself engaging in the conversation with ease, asking questions and offering solutions. There were a few moments when he stumbled or had to pause to think, but these were minor compared to the confidence he felt overall. The beer seemed impressed, not only with the quality of Samuel's produce, but with his ability to communicate effectively in English. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed on a deal, and Samuel felt a wave of relief and pride. The rest of the day followed a similar pattern. Each meeting brought its own challenges, but Samuel handled them with the confidence he had worked so hard to build. By the time the market closed, he had secured several new deals, expanding his business in ways he had never thought possible. As he packed up his stall and prepared to head home, Samuel couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The man who had once struggled to understand a simple letter in English was now conducting business with buyers from different cities, all in a language that had once seemed impossible to learn. The drive back to the farm was peaceful, the sun setting in the distance. As Samuel thought about the future, he knew that his journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more challenges to face, and more opportunities to grow. But for the first time in his life, Samuel felt truly capable. He had overcome the doubts, the setbacks, and the fear of failure that had once held him back. Now he was moving forward with a sense of purpose and clarity that had been missing for so long. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch, he reflected on the lessons he had learned along the way. Learning English had been about more than just expanding his business. It had been a journey of self-discovery, a process that had taught him the value of persistence, resilience, and the belief that anything was possible with enough hard work. The language had opened doors for him, but more importantly, it had shown him what he was capable of when he refused to give up. The farm was quiet as the stars began to appear in the sky. Samuel thought about the people who had supported him along the way, the tutor who had pushed him to be better, the buyers who had taken a chance on him, and even the animals on his farm, who had been his first practice partners. He smiled at the thought of how far he had come from those early days of speaking broken English to the cows to now negotiating deals with confidence and ease. As the night deepened, Samuel felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still long, but he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He knew that whatever challenges came his way, he had the tools and the determination to face them. His journey had been one of transformation, not just in terms of language, but in terms of how he saw himself and his place in the world. Samuel stood up, stretching as he looked out over the fields. The farm, which had once felt like a cage, now felt like a place of possibility. He could see the future he had always dreamed of, a future where his business thrived, where his name was known beyond the boundaries of his village, and where the hard work he had put in was finally paying off. And it all started with a simple decision to learn, to grow, and to never give up. With a smile on his face, Samuel turned and headed inside. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. The language that had once felt like a barrier was now a bridge to new opportunities, and Samuel was ready to cross it, one step at a time.